The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
And my experience in BC was tremendously good. I worked with so many good people throughout the years I was there. People that would drop everything to help you if you needed a hand. People that would, with very little backup, and as it exists today, would go out and deal with very difficult situations, you know. And my whole experience in BC was good, excepting for one factor. When I first went to Burnaby, to me, coming from K Division and Calgary, whereas as a staff sergeant, I had quite a lot to say about what went on. I discovered as a sub-inspector, I didn't have much to say about anything. But the detachment used to report to division headquarters, which was in Victoria. You had to go through what was called Westminster Subdivision. Well, Westminster Subdivision was just a small organization with an officer and a couple of people, but they had no other responsibility. They shut down at 4 in the afternoon, pulled a switch, so all the traffic came into Burnaby, and we handled it for them. Next day, sent it back to them so they knew what had happened and so on. So I wrote a report saying that the organization in the Lower Mainland is all wrong, and we have to move towards more amalgamation. The autonomous detachments, that label was just getting attached to them, operated like little fiefdoms on their own, and they were good. They were pretty darn good at their work, but there was very little coordination between them. And I said, we have to put this on a more regional basis. And I wrote my report and outlined a bunch of things. And I got called over to Victoria. I was then, I think I was still a sub-inspector, perhaps an inspector. I don't quite remember the timing. But I was marched into the CO's office, the Assistant Commissioner's office. I wasn't even invited to sit down. Yeah, I was a sub-inspector, because he said to me, Simmonds, sub-inspectors don't write reports about how the force should be organized. And I was marched out and went back to Burnaby with my tail between my legs. And it was not that many years later, I was the commissioner of the force, and one of the first divisional trips I made was back to BC. And they had a do at the officers' mess in view of my visit. And when I went in as the new commissioner, this old assistant commissioner came over, he said, I always knew you'd do well, Simmonds. and so that was the only sort of downtime, but my experience in British Columbia was so positive, and so many good people, and so much work, and that obviously some reorganization was needed. When I was the OC of the subdivision, we had the federal squads, which had jurisdiction all over the province. So they weren't part of your subdivision strength. But yet, if anything went wrong, you were held accountable for them. So I took a lot of exception to that, and that led to eventually a sort of an interim step called forming the Lower Mainland Division. And I was then promoted to a chief superintendent and made the commanding officer of the Lower Mainland Division. And I had over 2,000 personnel because it covered everything from Hope down through the Fraser Valley and up the Sunshine Coast. And we were busy, but it was still not the right organization. You had the super CO over in Victoria, you had the CO of the Lower Mainland Division, and there was always some question as to really who decided what, you know. And I hadn't been in that job very long, and I was freshly promoted to chief superintendent when I got a call from the commissioner. And the commissioner said, would you come down to Ottawa for an interview with the minister? I thought, oh boy, I must be in trouble. What does the minister want to see me? My experience in Alberta and British Columbia, when you talked about the minister, you were generally talking about the Attorney General. You weren't talking about somebody way down in Ottawa that you didn't really know who the Solicitor General was when you were out in the field in those days. So I said, well, what for? And he said, well, we're going to appoint some new deputies, and your name has come up, but the minister wants to see all the possible candidates. And I said, well, if I'm going to be a deputy, I'll be your deputy, not the minister's deputy. Do you want me? He says, oh, come on down and see the minister anyway. So I went to the minister's office, and that was Warren Almond at the time, whom I didn't know. And he was not present, so a secretary told me to go in and sit down and wait, and the minister would be along soon. Well, on his desk, I noticed a little statue of a hockey player. So I thought, oh, this guy's interested in hockey. I also saw files piled up on chairs all over the building, too. So he came, we shook hands, and I started the conversation. I said, you must be a hockey player. And he says, I still play old-timers hockey. And he said, I know lots of people. I said, so do I. I know lots of people in the hockey world. I've played against NHL old-timers and one thing and another. And it's always been of great interest to me. And we talked about hockey for 3/4 of an hour. And then finally he said, you know, I read a report that you made over a very difficult situation in British Columbia involving an Indian roadblock that you had taken down. And he said, I was quite impressed. Tell me about it. So that started a new line of conversation. And I said to him, well, basically, I was quite critical in my report of both the federal and the provincial political administrations for not dealing openly with the Indians and trying to settle some of the issues, you know. So I said, I have quite a lot of experience dealing with Indians, and I have quite a lot of sympathy with a lot of their problems. And I said, that goes back to when I was a boy growing up near North Battleford, where my father was an early homesteader, and where 20 years earlier the Northwest Rebellion of '85 had taken place. And the Indians were then all cooped up on reserves. And I used to look at our homestead and say how lucky we are and how unlucky those people are. And when we were kids, my mother used to go to the reserve and buy clothing. We always wore Indian moccasins in the winter, and we had buckskin jackets and one thing and another. And she used to say, it'll help those poor old Indian women that work so hard doing the preparing the leather and doing the beadwork. Plus that, they'll wear better than the stuff Timothy Eaton sells anyway. Because when you lived out on the farm, your shopping was at Timothy Eaton's store in Winnipeg. You know, there were no department stores or anything like that around. So I had grown up with quite a lot of sympathy for them, like every young policeman in the West, and probably in the Maritimes too, but certainly in Alberta, I had my run-ins with Indians who had run afoul of the law in one way or another, often for relatively minor offenses involving excessive use of liquor or small thefts and one thing or another. But I always used to, in the back of my mind, I always said how lucky I was that I wasn't one of them, because if I was, I would have been an out-and-out alcoholic or the biggest thorn in the side of the government they ever knew, because some of the treaty obligations had not been really well met. And these people were penned up in the reserves, a lot they weren't allowed to do. At the end of the war, you know, we had some, in some of the Saskatchewan regiments, there were quite a lot of Indians, and they were very, very good soldiers. At the end of the war, they came back. They weren't even allowed to go to the Legion to drink with their old buddies because the Indian Act didn't permit them to have liquor or to enter. It was bad. So I had quite a lot of sympathy. So I told the minister, I said, you know, a lot has to be done. A lot of these problems have to be resolved. And there's no sense setting them aside. They will grow worse, they'll grow bigger, and they'll be more difficult and more expensive to resolve if they're not done quite quickly. And so we had a very interesting conversation. And I left thinking, well, I'm going back to Vancouver. I'm the token Westerner Anglophone. So they wouldn't, because out west, everybody thought you had to be a Francophone and bilingual to get a high position in Ottawa. Well, just a few days later, I got a phone call from the commissioner saying, you're being transferred to Ottawa, you'll be a deputy commissioner. So from a junior chief superintendent, it meant that I missed an awful lot of very valuable experience that you would have got if you had been longer in the chief superintendent's rank or had been an assistant commissioner, which skipped all that. And in many ways, I was one of the most ill-prepared people to be the commissioner of the force that they could have imagined. But I hadn't been in Ottawa very long when they had a large board of very senior people in government to decide who the next commissioner would be. And there were quite a number of people interviewed, both within the force, outside the force. At least one city police chief who I had a lot of respect for, a very senior officer in the military who was about to retire, a senior public servant, and quite a number of senior officers of the RCMP. And following the board, I was called to the Prime Minister's office, which was Mr. Trudeau at the time, and I didn't really know him either. And I had a couple of long interviews with him. And finally he said, we're going to make you the next commissioner. So in the fall of 1977, when Commissioner Nadon retired, I was suddenly the commissioner. Thank goodness I had an awful lot of good people in headquarters that knew how to run the force. I sure knew how to do police work, but the administration of this big organization and fitting into the Ottawa bureaucracy, where you have to spend an awful lot of your time, and keeping that all essential proper relationship with government in hand. And that takes a little explanation. The government is elected by the people. The RCMP as a federal institution is accountable to that government. The political authorities, though, have no right to tell a peace officer who he should investigate or who should be charged or who shouldn't. And you have to keep the government sufficiently informed that you're accountable, and yet you have to preserve to the police judgment the investigative activity and so on. You have to advise your minister enough so that he doesn't look like a fool in question period when the question arises about some issue that's causing headlines in the media involving the force. So he has to be able to answer questions. And very often you would say to him, the right answer is, the commissioner has told me it's under investigation and he will report his findings in due course. But sometimes that's a little difficult for ministers. They want to be a little more outspoken. So you have that very delicate balance. One of the, during my 10 years as commissioner, there were 4 prime ministers, and one of them twice. There were 7 solicitors general, so you spent an awful lot of time briefing ministers about the organization, and you needed ministerial support for resources before Treasury Board and so on, and so it's not an easy office to fulfill. Along with that, you've got all the internal problems within the organization that you have to address, and I was well aware of some of them on my road up. Probably any senior officer could tell you this. They had back when I was an NCO, and we used to have what were known as service courts. I was several times called upon people that were charged in the orderly room with offences under the RCMP Act, and they would call me to be their friend in court. I'm not going to use defence because that sounds like illegal. You were their friend in court, and you would argue for them and one thing or another. And I was called upon several times by members to represent them in the orderly room. And I might say I was spectacularly unsuccessful. And I soon learned that when you're charged in an orderly room in those days, there was not much point in fighting it. You were convicted before you went in. Later on, when I was a junior officer at the West Coast, I think I was made trial officer at about 7 different occasions where some young person was charged under the Act. And sometimes it was well-deserved, and sometimes, in my view, it wasn't. And I wasn't backwards about discharging the charges against them, following which you'd get a memo out of headquarters saying, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't do that, and don't forget the good discipline of the force and one thing or other. So when I became the Deputy Commissioner of Administration, which surprised me because my background was so operational, but I spoke at length with the people in A Directorate and so on about the system, and I was never able to get some of the changes that were absolutely necessary. Fundamentally, the average young person that comes to the force is well-motivated, keen young people, often from families that are very proud that their son or their daughter has got into the organization. Some do quite well in their training and some do less well, but there's a very small rejection rate at the depot level of those that didn't do well. They're sent out to the field and they start their field training. And the problem in the field, the fellow in charge of a detachment or a squad, he has no choice about who he gets. He can't bid for the guy he wants to help him do his job. He gets whoever is sent to him, whether he's good or he's bad. Now, you get somebody that's not a very good performer, perhaps. Do you really run him down? You got to depend on this guy to be on the night shift next day. How do you really judge this person without so hurting him that that it will cause more problems that you'd solve? So we had this great dilemma between discipline and the system to deal with internal problems. On 2 or 3 occasions, we had cases that came up to my level through the appeal process where suddenly some young person was not fit to be in the organization according to his immediate supervisor and everybody between then and when it got to my level. So I would ask for his file, and I'd read about what they said upon his graduation in depot, about his performance there. I would read the annual assessments from our NCOs, or in charge of the unit that he was in, the detachment or whatever. And often I found that they had quite good ratings. You know, nobody was below at least normal. A lot of them were above, were even higher than that. So I would say, you know, what happened? Look at this man's ratings, and all of a sudden he's no good. I mean, what happened in between? I wanted to see him transferred back to a fellow that said he was pretty good, and see if he can work there. There were the odd case where obviously the person had to go, but they weren't a lot. And you know, by the time you get a person with 4 or 5 years in the force, there's been a big investment in his career, in the training, in the development, in everything that goes with the costing of a member of the force, and you don't want to dispose of that lightly. And if you feel that you have to ensure that the fellow has a fair opportunity to express his side, and just not lower the boom the way it used to be when I was defending people as a NCO many years before. My 10 years of before I actually took office, after I had been told I would be the commissioner early in 1977, and before I actually took office in September, 1st September 77, the MacDonald Commission was formed, and Commissioner Nadon was in the chair at that time. And by the time I got there, the MacDonald Commission was in full sway. Well, I had never served in the security service in my career up till then. So in order to deal with the problems of MacDonald, I spent long, long hours and many weekends just reading files, trying to find out what went on and why. And those were very difficult days because from a police perspective, the law enforcement side, police perspective, some of the things that had gone on in that organization were wrong. And yet, what they were doing was the way intelligence services all over the world tend to operate. They bend a lot of rules. They go a lot of places where if you went there as a policeman, you'd be in trouble if you didn't have the proper warrant from a judge and so on, you know. So those were very trying years, and instead of being able to really spend the time that I wanted making some internal changes, an awful lot of it was dealing with particularly the MacDonald Commission, but there were several other commissions of inquiry going on at the same time. And my background had all been in Alberta and British Columbia, and all of these commissions were in other parts of the country about difficulties that the force had experienced, which meant that I had an awful lot of homework to do. Many days, my lights didn't go out till midnight when I'd finally lock the files up and go home. So it was, to me, I guess, the highlight of over 40 years in a wonderful organization was the opportunity that it gave me to work with, alongside of, under, and sometimes in charge of the most wonderful bunch of people that you could put together anywhere. You know, I know so many individual cases of how our members went and dealt with extraordinarily difficult situations, which don't make any headlines at all. The headlines is some poor guy that is perceived, at least in the views of the media, to have done something wrong. Policing changed greatly too, starting in about the mid-50s. You know, I think back to my early days in the force and my early days in plain clothes. In my early days in the force, we were also the prosecutors, and the court used to be called the police court. It wasn't the provincial court, it was the police court. And you took your cases up before the magistrates, and you were the prosecutor. You were also sometimes the star witness, so you also had to give your evidence first and allow the defense to cross-examine you, and then you went down and sat there as the prosecutor and prosecuted. So that system couldn't last, but that was the outgrowth from the early days of the West, where the force was the only really presence of the government at all. The judges were often senior officers of the force, and in fact, up until probably sometime, I'm not sure the date, but it was still that way when I joined the force in 1947. If you were superintendent or above, you had the judicial equivalent of 2 justices of the peace, and that was, you had that judicial authority as officers of the force. Well, that eventually had to change as society progressed and changed. And then in the 50s, we had bail reform. Nobody can argue against it, but I can tell you, from the point of view of dealing with serious crime, it made it much more difficult. And I'll just talk about that for a moment. When I first went into plain clothes in Calgary, it wasn't very long before you knew all the so-called professional criminals, and they all knew you. And if you caught one, say a bank robbery or a safe blowing or whatever the crime may have been in those days, if they were well caught, they would and dealt with honestly by the police, they would go into court and plead guilty. They wanted to get their sentence started. They didn't want to pay a lot of fancy money for lawyers. Well, what happened with legal aid and bail reform, and you can't argue against any of these things as being progress in our society, but the moment bail reform came in and they were able to get bail, they went out and they got twice as active as ever, because they knew someday they still had to appear before the court, and they wanted to raise some money, and they wanted to leave their organizations in the hands of responsible people that will keep things going while they were locked up. At that same time, we also gained what in my view was important legislation, which was the Privacy Act in the Criminal Code, which allowed for electronic surveillance and one thing or another. That was widespread throughout the police well before it was in the law, because it was not illegal. It was, in fact, in many of the provinces, the telephone companies, which were generally provincially owned, they had a special section in there to cooperate with the police, because they preferred that to having police putting on spurs and climbing poles and intercepting phone calls and one thing or another. And it was very tightly controlled at least within the RCMP. I won't speak for other police forces, but it was widespread. Finally, they put it into legislation, which made it possible. But if you take a look at what that entailed, the length of time investigators now had to put in preparing affidavits to get the authority, plus the one weakness in that legislation, which was after a certain length of time, you had to advise the people that they had been subject to this surveillance. Well, you know, professional crooks, they go on forever. So you have to advise them they've been subject of electronic surveillance. They were just a lot more careful the next time. So we went through a lot of changes in those years. Policing became much more difficult, much more expensive too. Internal changes, when I relate back to my days on detachment and in plain clothes, there was no such thing as overtime pay.